Today, we're diving into a short, ancient letter that has kicked off some of the fiercest debates in history. It comes from the Apostle Paul, written to a handful of new churches in a region called Galatia. And for 2,000 years, its message has been incredibly influential and, intensely divisive.
People who've studied this letter, they really don't pull any punches. They've called it a crucifixion epistle, a thorny jungle, and even said that every sentence is a thunderbolt. So this was definitely not meant to be light reading. So that's the big question, right? Why does this one little letter provoke such incredibly strong reactions? I mean, both passionate defense and just intense dislike. Okay, let's get into this historical and theological mystery. So, first things first, we've got to understand what makes this letter so explosive. Because right out of the gate, it just smashes all the rules of how you were supposed to write a letter back then. According to our source material, there are 5 big reasons for all the controversy. For one, it is so emotional. Paul is writing at what's been called white heat, just filled with this burning passion. It's also super personal, almost like reading his diary. But at the same time, it's highly intellectual, weaving this tight, complex argument. And weirdly enough, it's also too spiritual. It just strips away every last bit of religious pride. And finally, let's be honest, it's just plain argumentative. This is a direct fight, not with outsiders, but with other Christians. That confrontational tone makes a whole lot more sense when you realize just how urgent the situation was. This wasn't some casual update. This was an emergency broadcast. Okay, so you gotta picture this. Back in the 1st century Roman Empire, there's no post office. To send a letter, you had to find someone you trusted who was traveling in the right direction and then pay them. It was expensive, it was slow, it was a total gamble. You only went through all that trouble when you had something absolutely critical to say.
Now this is where things get really interesting, because you see how Paul just throws the rulebook out the window? A normal letter back then always had a section of praise or some nice compliments right after the greeting. But Paul, he just skips it completely. He basically goes from hello straight into red-hot criticism. This is the ancient equivalent of a blaring fire alarm. It means there's a massive emergency happening right now.
And, the guy writing this letter, he was maybe the only person who could have done it. Paul started out as Saul of Tarsus, an ultra-Orthodox Pharisee. I mean, this guy knew the Jewish law inside and out and was so passionate about it that he actively tried to stamp out the early Christian movement. Then, he has this dramatic conversion experience, and he flips, becoming the most passionate missionary for the very faith he once tried to destroy. So, the point is, he got both sides of this argument better than pretty much anyone else. So what was this conflict? What was the big emergency that made Paul break all the rules and write this thunderbolt of a letter? Well, here's what was going down. After Paul started these new faith communities, some other teachers came in right behind him, and they started telling the Galatians that Paul's message was, incomplete, that believing in Jesus was a great start, but it just wasn't enough. They were teaching the gospel plus something else. And this right here just lays it all out. The new teachers were basically preaching faith plus you got to keep the law. They insisted that to be truly right with God, these non-Jewish believers had to start following Jewish laws and customs, starting with circumcision. But Paul's message was totally different. It was faith from first to last. For him, adding anything to faith wasn't an upgrade. It was a total corruption of the whole message. And Paul saw right through this. He knew it wasn't just about one little ritual. As the source material puts it with this great metaphor, circumcision was just the camel's nose in the tent. Once you let that in, you better believe the rest of the camel, the entire system of 613 laws, was coming right in behind it. It was a total shift from a relationship based on grace to a religion based on your performance. And this, folks, brings us to the absolute heart of Paul's argument, his radical idea of what true freedom is. For Paul, the gospel wasn't a new list of rules, it was liberation. But it was a kind of freedom that had to be guarded really carefully, a freedom he saw as being on a knife's edge. So on one side of this knife's edge, Paul saw this danger he called legalism. Think of it like a cage. It's the trap of trying to earn your way to God by ticking off a bunch of boxes and following rules. It's a religion of works that he says just kills the spirit and puts you right back in chains. But then, on the other side of the path, there's this totally opposite danger, license. And if legalism is the cage, this is the swamp. It's the mistake of thinking that freedom from the law means freedom to do whatever you want, whenever you want. Paul argues that's just a different kind of slavery. You just become a slave to your own appetites. So Paul's whole idea of true liberty is walking this razor-thin path, a striding edge, right, between the cage of legalism on one side and the swamp of license on the other. It's a delicate balance, and you've got to pay attention to not fall into either trap.
And this, right here, is the absolute bombshell of Galatians. The real freedom that Paul is fighting for isn't the freedom to do whatever you please. It's the power, the ability to say no to the things that would end up enslaving you. It's the freedom not to sin.
Okay, so if this freedom isn't about following a bunch of rules, and it's not about just doing whatever you feel like, then what is it? What does it actually look like in a person's life? Well, Paul argues it leads to a completely new way of living. Paul says you live out this true freedom by, and this is his phrase, walking in the Spirit. Now, this isn't some vague, floaty idea. He argues it's a practical, everyday way of living that produces a real, tangible result in a person's character, something he calls the fruit of the Spirit. And he describes what this looks like using a really cool metaphor, a single fruit that has 9 different flavors that all grow together. It's not a to-do list of virtues you have to achieve. Instead, he says, as a person walks this narrow path of freedom, their life just naturally starts to show harmony with God. Things like love, joy, and peace. Harmony with other people through patience, kindness, goodness. And finally, harmony with yourself through faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. And it's because of this really powerful, totally uncompromising defense of freedom, freedom from the law and freedom for a whole new way of living, that this short, angry little letter has been called the Magna Carta of Christian liberty. It is a foundational document for an entire way of looking at faith. And that leaves us with this final thought to chew on. In a world that so often defines freedom as the absolute right to do whatever you want, this ancient letter hits us with a radical alternative. That maybe, just maybe, true freedom is the power and ability not to do the things that harm us and others. What could an ideal like that possibly mean for us today?